So if you hold EOS right now, a simple, unlimited approval signature that you make today on a cross-chain bridge could literally sit dormant in a smart contract and cost you your entire portfolio 6 months from now.
Right. Even if your migration today goes absolutely perfectly.
Which is terrifying. Welcome to the deep dive. It is May 1st, 2026. The highly anticipated Vaulta A token migration is officially live.
It is.
And today we are going to look at the math, the underlying mechanics, and, well, the irreversible traps that are kind of hidden in this transition.
Yeah, because what's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the technical orchestration required for an entire ecosystem to deprecate a massive legacy asset and shift to a new native standard.
Right.
We aren't just looking at, a simple visual rebrand on a centralized database. The source material maps out a multi-layered transition touching diverse wallet architectures, cross-chain messaging protocols, and fundamental shifts in how network resources are allocated.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a massive mountain of documentation detailing this migration from EOS to Vaulta's new token, which is known simply as A.
Just A.
Just A. And our mission today is to tear down the engine of this migration manual piece by piece so you can execute this transition safely. We're bypassing the basic definitions. We know you understand the stakes here.
Exactly.
Think of this process like exchanging a legacy national currency for a newly minted one. But instead of walking into a commercial bank to handle the logistics with a friendly teller, you are operating entirely in a decentralized environment where the bank vault is made of immutable code.
Yeah, and you are the teller.
Right.
You're the compliance officer, and you're the vault manager all at once. And that level of absolute sovereignty requires an equally absolute understanding of the environment you're operating in.
For sure.
The guide we are analyzing today, it doesn't offer a single monolithic set of instructions because, well, the current location of your assets drastically alters your risk profile.
Okay, so where you're starting from changes the whole journey.
Exactly. The documentation matrix breaks the migration down into 4 specific environments. You've got the official on-chain Unicove portal, DEX aggregators, centralized exchanges, and then cross-chain bridges.
So just looking at this matrix, the fragmentation of modern liquidity pools really becomes apparent. You'd think a token migration is a simple query, right? Like take old token, burn it, mint new token.
Right, in a perfect world.
But the document immediately forces us to classify the exact nature of our holdings. And it establishes the official Unicode portal as the gold standard, offering a pure 1-to-1 conversion ratio.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the reason the official portal guarantees that 1-to-1 ratio with literally 0 slippage is because it is interacting directly with the native smart contract deployed by the Vaulta protocol engineers.
Okay.
It isn't relying on a liquidity pool's constant product formula to determine a price. It's a deterministic state transition.
A deterministic state transition, so meaning
you submit one EOS to the migration contract. The contract permanently locks or burns that EOS and deterministically mints exactly 1 E token directly to your address. There's no math for the market to figure out.
Wow. Okay. But that deterministic burn and mint function, that only works if you are holding the native asset on the native chain.
Right.
The moment you step outside that specific ecosystem, the math gets really messy.
It does. I mean, the documentation points out that using a centralized exchange for this migration introduces heavy custodial trade-offs.
Custodial meaning you don't hold the keys.
Exactly. You might benefit from the CEX handling the technical migration on their internal ledgers so it feels easier, but you are subject to deposit and withdrawal network mismatches.
Which is a huge risk.
It is. If you accidentally route a native token to an exchange address strictly configured for, say, an EVM network, those funds hit an incompatible receiving script, and they're essentially locked in the void.
Gone.
Yeah,
I want to push back on the framing of this matrix, though, because the guide positions the Unicove portal as the obvious superior choice. It explicitly states, and I quote, if you already hold EOS on the EOS Vaulta chain, use Anchor Wallet plus Unicove.
Yes, it's a very clear directive.
It's treated as a hard rule. But if this native 1-to-1 swap is so mathematically perfect and entirely devoid of slippage, why does the document dedicate so much space to DX routing, aggregators, and bridging?
Well,
why would a user intentionally choose to absorb the financial hit of liquidity pool slippage rather than just walking through the official native door?
Because of the reality of wrapped assets and cross-chain composability, you might look at your portfolio tracker and see a balance of EOS, right?
Yeah.
But under the hood, you don't actually hold the cryptographic key to a native EOS token. You hold an ERC20 representation.
An IOU.
Exactly, an IOU on an entirely different network, say Arbitrum or Optimism or Polygon. Your capital has been deployed in yield farms or lending protocols across the entire EVM landscape.
So it's less like holding the legacy currency in your pocket and more like holding a promissory note for that currency written by a bank in a foreign jurisdiction.
That is the mechanical reality, yes. If your assets are wrapped on an EVM chain, you literally cannot physically interact with the native Unicove burn and mint contract.
It just won't recognize it.
Right, your cryptographic signature is completely invalid on the Vaulta network. You have to navigate the cross-chain routing infrastructure to unwrap, bridge, and eventually swap.
Which sounds exhausting.
It is. But before we get into the heavy cryptography of cross-chain bridging, the document mandates a really rigorous setup phase for those who actually are on the native chain.
Right, the digital workshop preparation. Because you can't just dive in. The guide lists a highly specific set of prerequisites before you even think about connecting a wallet to Unicove.
Yeah, the emphasis here is squarely on isolation and verification. The document explicitly points to Anchor Wallet. It isn't just suggesting any browser extension you might have installed. It points to a specific client architecture known for handling the AOCO account structure and resource allocation mechanics securely.
And the mandate for offline backups is highlighted aggressively in the text. I mean, we all know the drill with seed phrases, but the framing here feels really urgent.
It does.
It demands verification that the specific private key associated with the active EOS account is backed up physically.
And that urgency stems from the nature of a massive network transition. When a major protocol undergoes a token migration like this, network activity absolutely spikes. RPC endpoints get hammered with queries, and client software can just crash or desynchronize.
Wow, okay.
If your local key store file gets corrupted during a machine crash on May 1st and you haven't validated your offline derivation path,
Oh, no.
yeah, the fact that you were halfway through a legitimate migration won't save you. There is no cryptographic backdoor in the Vaulta contract to recover funds sent from an unrecoverable key.
So you really need to do your pre-flight checks. You do them on the tarmac, not in the air.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When we dig into the specific transaction parameter that the documentation outlines for this native swap, we hit a massive architectural divergence from what the broader DeFi market is accustomed to.
The fee structure.
Yes. The guide provides screenshots of the Anchor Wallet interface during the signing process, and it focuses heavily on network fees, or, well, rather the complete absence of them.
Right, the implementation of the resource model versus the gas model. This is perhaps the most significant friction reduction mechanism detailed in the entire source material.
Seriously. The screenshot in the guide shows the Transaction Overview tab in Anchor. Right in the center is this bright green indicator that reads, Free transaction. The cost of this transaction has been covered for you.
Yeah.
And below that, it specifies that the network resources are being provided by Gray Mass Fuel. Now, for anyone who has spent the last 5 years hoarding ETH or Matic just to ensure they can literally broadcast a transaction, this feels almost alien.
It really does.
Yeah.
To understand why this is so critical for a token migration, we have to look at the underlying state machine.
Okay, break that down for us.
So on an EVM network, computation is metered by gas. Every single operation, verifying a signature, modifying a storage slot, transferring a token, it all consumes a specific unit of gas.
Which you have to pay for.
Right, and it must be paid for in the network's native asset. This creates the infamous dust trap.
Oh, the dust trap, where you have like $1,000 in stable coins or legacy tokens, but you have literally 0 ETH in your wallet. So you cannot physically execute the contract to move your own capital. You are computationally frozen.
Yes. And the user is then forced to source gas from a centralized exchange, withdraw it, wait for finality, and only then execute their swap. But the EOS and Vaulta architecture utilizes a fundamentally different paradigm. Instead of a paper computation gas model, it historically utilized a staked resource model, CPU, net, and RAM.
But the guide isn't telling users to, calculate their CPU milliseconds or byte storage. It's just saying the transaction is entirely free. So who is paying for the block space? Because the math has to balance somewhere.
It does, and this is the brilliance of delegated resource abstraction. The Vaulta network allows for a mechanism where a smart contract or a service provider, in this specific case, gray mass fuel, can cryptographically co-sign a transaction.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they pledge their own staked resources to cover the bandwidth and computational cost of the user's action. The user simply signs the intent to swap EOS for A.
That is so clean.
It is. Graymass Fuel's automated systems detect the transaction, they wrap it in a fee delegation envelope, and broadcast it to the block producers.
So it's essentially a protocol-level paymaster. It strips away the most brutal user experience hurdle in decentralized finance. The
Exactly.
user doesn't need to understand the underlying computational overhead. They just verify the one-to-one token math and sign the message.
It fundamentally alters the psychology of the migration. It completely removes the hesitation of, how much is this going to cost me in network fees, and allows the user to focus entirely on routing and security.
Which brings us directly to the execution of the golden route, the native, on-chain swap via Unicove. The guide breaks this down into a highly deterministic flow.
Right. Assuming the user has validated their Anchor key store and confirmed their network RPC connection, the process begins by utilizing Unicove not just as a decentralized exchange interface, but as a state verifier.
Yeah, the document is very specific about this part. You don't just connect and blindly click swap. You use Unicove's advanced block explorer capabilities to verify the exact string of your account name and your current legacy EOS balance on the native chain.
Because in the EOSIO architecture, accounts are heavily abstracted compared to the raw hexadecimal public keys used in Ethereum.
Right, they look like real words.
Exactly. You are dealing with human-readable account names. Verifying the exact account name resolution ensures the wallet hasn't defaulted to a secondary derivation path or a completely different account tree altogether.
That makes total sense. Once that resolution is verified, the UI flow described in the screenshots is, well, starkly minimalist. You connect Anchor, and the Unicove interface populates a blue banner. Vaulta now uses the A token, EOS, available to swap.
Very clear.
Super clear. The interface is hard-coded. You input your EOS amount, and the destination box populates the exact corresponding integer of A tokens. There are no slippage tolerance gears to tweak, no routing paths to select.
Because it is a direct invocation of the migration contract. But here is where the operational doctrine of the source material becomes incredibly strict. It introduces a protocol that absolutely every user should adopt, which is the test tranche.
The test tranche. The guide specifically asks, how much should you convert? And the answer is a hard stop on the max button. It dictates sending a fractional amount, say just 10 EOS, verifying the state transition, and only then processing the bulk of the portfolio.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of decentralized systems, the test tranche is really the only logical defense against systemic complexity.
But wait, if the Unicove UI is hard-coded to a one-to-one migration contract, and the transaction fees are completely abstracted away by gray mass fuel, what exactly are we testing? If the math is deterministic, isn't a test transaction just, paranoid redundancy?
Not at all. It is testing the environmental variables that sit outside the smart contract. You are testing your wallet's RPC node connection. You are testing your own visual verification of the account names.
Okay.
You are ensuring that there isn't a zero-day UI bug rendering the transaction payload incorrectly before you sign it. In an environment defined by the total absence of chargebacks or administrative undo functions, isolating your risk to a 10-token payload is literally the cheapest insurance policy in cryptography. You mathematically prove the local pathway before committing serious capital.
Wow, phrased like that makes perfect sense. So what does this all mean for the verification process? Like, how do we know the test actually worked beyond just looking at our wallet balance and hoping it's right?
The guide instructs users to look for a highly specific set of cryptographic confirmations. When the test transaction is broadcast and validated by the block producers, Unicove generates a transaction receipt with a very distinct UI element.
Right. The screenshots show a massive green check mark with the words transaction complete, and right below that, an alphanumeric transaction hash. The guide gives an example format, like 04C2F followed by a long string. But the most critical piece of data on that screen is the status indicator. It reads, in all caps, irreversible.
Yes. That term has a very specific technical definition in delegated proof-of-stake consensus mechanisms. It doesn't just mean the transaction was broadcast to the network. It means the block containing your migration transaction has been validated by a supermajority of the active block producers.
Oh, wow.
At that point, the state transition is permanently embedded in the chain's history. It cannot be reorganized. It cannot be rolled back.
And once you have that irreversible hash for your 10-token test tranche, you have empirical proof that your local environment, your key, and the protocol's contract are all perfectly aligned.
Exactly.
You can smash the mags button for the rest of your portfolio with total confidence.
That is the optimal execution path. But returning to our earlier discussion regarding liquidity fragmentation, we must address the users who are holding wrapped EOS on external networks. Because the source material categorizes this cross-chain process, and it introduces a massive, massive escalation in risk.
Right, the Wild West of bridging. The document lists routing aggregators like Rango and LIFI. It acknowledges that moving assets across entirely different consensus mechanisms requires a highly complex sequence of events.
It does. To map this out, we really have to look at how a cross-chain aggregator actually functions under the hood.
Walk us through it.
Okay, so when a user requests a route from, say, wrapped EOS on Arbitrum to native A on Vaulta, the aggregator is executing a complex pathfinding algorithm. It is scanning multiple decentralized exchanges to unwrap the token, locating a bridge protocol with sufficient liquidity on both the source and destination chains, and chaining these smart contract calls together.
It's essentially international shipping logistics, but executed in milliseconds. You're packing your legacy asset into a shipping container. The bridge is the customs authority inspecting and locking it on the source chain, and a completely separate entity on the Vaulta chain is minting a corresponding asset when they receive the cryptographic proof that the container was locked.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the vulnerability points. Unlike the native Unicove swap, which is a single atomic transaction, a cross-chain bridge requires multiple asynchronous state transitions. And the first point of friction highlighted in the guide is the approve function.
Oh man, this is a massive topic. The native EOS holders using Anchor didn't have to touch this at all. But the moment you interact with an EVM-based bridge, or DAX, you run headfirst into allowance mappings. Let's break down the technical reality of what an approval actually does to a user's wallet.
Right, so in the ERC20 token standard, which dictates how most tokens on EVM networks operate, a smart contract cannot arbitrarily pull funds from a user's address.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. To enable a bridge or a DX to move your wrapped EOS, you must manually interact with the ERC20 contract's approve function. You are digitally signing a transaction that updates a mapping in the token's contract, explicitly stating that a specific external address, like the bridge router, is allowed to transfer a specific integer of your tokens on your behalf.
On the surface, that sounds like a solid security model. You are explicitly granting permission. So what's the issue?
The vulnerability arises from user experience optimizations. To prevent users from having to pay gas fees for an approval transaction every single time they want to execute a swap, many decentralized applications default the approval request to an effectively infinite integer, maxent.
So instead of approving exactly 100 wrapped EOS for the exact bridge transaction I want to make today, the UI prompts me to sign an approval for an infinite amount of that token. Forever.
Exactly. And the vast majority of users blindly sign that infinite allowance because they just want to complete their migration and get it over with.
This raises a critical security flaw. If I bridge my 100 tokens today and the transaction is irreversible, that bridge contract still holds the infinite allowance in the token's mapping.
It does. It sits dormant. And this is the exact scenario the documentation is warning against. If 6 months from now, that bridge protocol suffers a smart contract exploit, like if a hacker manages to compromise the router contract, they can execute a sweep of every single user wallet that ever granted an unlimited approval.
Oh my God.
The hacker doesn't need your private key or your seed phrase. You already gave their compromised contract the cryptographic permission to take your tokens.
That is a staggering architectural risk for a user who's trying to migrate an old token.
It really is.
The guide's countermeasure is pretty blunt. Manually edit the approval limit in your wallet UI to match the exact amount you are bridging. If you are moving 500 wrapped EOS, you set the allowance to exactly 500, the transaction completes, the allowance drops to 0, and the backdoor is completely closed.
It requires a small amount of extra effort, and yeah, you will have to pay for another approval if you bridge again in the future, but it fundamentally neutralizes the post-migration smart contract risk.
Absolutely worth it. So we've navigated the approval mapping, we've initiated the bridge transaction, and we wait for the cross-chain messaging protocol to verify the lock on the source chain. But the documentation points out another highly dangerous friction point in this asynchronous process, which is the claim.
Ah, yes. The claim mechanism is where many users mistakenly believe they have lost their entire portfolio, because bridging is not always a push mechanism.
Let's use our shipping analogy again. Sometimes the package doesn't get delivered straight to your front door on the Vaulta network. Sometimes it gets held at the destination post office, and you have to physically go down there, present your ID, and pull the package out of their vault.
That's exactly it. From a smart contract perspective, the bridge has verified your deposit on the source chain, and the destination contract on Vaulta has allocated the equivalent assets. But those assets remain in the bridge's holding contract until you, the user, execute a transaction on the Vaulta network to initiate the transfer to your specific address.
And the guide is very clear about the symptoms of missing this step. It says, if you miss it, the transfer may appear stuck, even when the first part completed successfully. You're looking at an empty Vaulta wallet, completely panicking, while your assets are just sitting in the bridge's destination contract waiting for a cryptographic pull request.
Which highlights the absolute necessity of tracking the transaction hash through the aggregator's UI.
Right.
The bridge interface will typically provide a link or a button to complete the claim, but users often close the browser tab way too early, assuming the process is fully automated.
Even after you claim the bridged asset, you aren't done. If you bridged wrapped EOS onto Vaulta, you now hold bridged EOS on Vaulta, not the native A token. You still have to execute a DX swap.
Yep, another step.
Which brings us to the financial reality of automated market makers and the concept of slippage.
Slippage is the invisible tax of decentralized finance. The documentation gives highly specific parameters for this, 0.1% to 0.5% for high liquidity pairs and up to 2.0% for low liquidity.
But what is physically happening in the liquidity pool to cause this loss of value? Like, why doesn't the price just stay fixed?
Because a DX relies on a mathematical formula, typically the constant product formula, x multiplied by y equals k, to price assets within a liquidity pool. The pool holds a balance of wrapped EOS and A tokens. When you execute a swap, you are removing A tokens and adding wrapped EOS. By changing the ratio of assets in the pool, you inherently change the price.
Okay, so if I dump a massive amount of wrapped EOS into a shallow pool, the algorithm aggressively devalues my wrapped EOS and charges me a massive premium for the A tokens I'm pulling out, just to keep the K constant balance.
Precisely. Your own trade pushes the price against you. Slippage tolerance is simply a parameter you set in your transaction payload that tells the smart contract, if the execution price deviates from my expected quote by more than this percentage, revert the transaction.
Right, cancel it. But setting a high slippage tolerance, say, accepting the 2% maximum suggested in the guide for low liquidity, introduces a secondary predatory risk, the mempool mechanics.
Maximum extractable value, or MEV. This is where high slippage becomes actively dangerous.
Because when I broadcast my transaction to the network, it doesn't instantly execute. It sits in a public waiting room, the mempool, waiting for a block producer to pick it up. And in that waiting room, specialized bots are scanning every single pending transaction.
Right. If an MEV bot sees your pending migration transaction and it sees that you have signed a 2% slippage tolerance on a very large order, the bot knows exactly how much it can manipulate the pool before your transaction fails.
Oh, wow.
The bot pays a higher gas fee to jump ahead of you in the block, intentionally skews the pool's ratio, allows your trade to execute at the absolute worst possible price you authorized, and then immediately backruns your trade to pocket the arbitrage profit.
They are essentially legally front-running your migration.
Exactly.
Which is exactly why the documentation's rule is so critical. If an aggregator quotes you high slippage, do not just accept it to get the migration over with.
Stop.
You are mathematically guaranteeing a loss of capital.
Yes.
The guide suggests splitting large amounts into smaller tranches to minimize the price impact on the pool's curve, or just utilizing a completely different aggregator that routes through deeper liquidity.
It perfectly illustrates why the guide pushes users toward the native Unicove portal if at all possible. The cross-chain route exposes the user to allowance risks, asynchronous claim delays, AMM price impact, and adversarial MEV extraction. It's a lot.
It really is a lot. Okay, we've covered the theoretical physics of both the Golden Route and the Wild West. But even with perfect preparation, when you are dealing with distributed networks, RPC latency, and complex UI layers, things will occasionally break. The final section of our source material acts as a triage manual for when the screen just doesn't show what you expect.
Troubleshooting in a decentralized environment requires a very analytical mindset. You have to separate the truth of the blockchain state from the interpretation provided by the wallet software.
This is the most common panic point. The guide calls it out specifically. Tokens not visible after swap. You executed the test tranche, the Anchor UI showed the signing, you waited, and nothing. Your balance in your wallet extension still shows 0 tokens. The instinct is to just assume the protocol stole your money.
Of course. But this is where we must apply the concept of node desynchronization. Your wallet software, Anchor, MetaMask, or any other client does not hold your money.
Right.
Your money exists as a state entry on the decentralized ledger. Your wallet is merely a piece of software executing JSON RPC calls to a specific network node, asking that node to report the current balance associated with your public key.
Think of it like a stock ticker terminal. The blockchain is the actual exchange floor in New York where the trade executed and was finalized. Your wallet UI is just the Bloomberg terminal sitting on your desk.
That's a great way to look at it.
If your terminal loses its internet connection or connects to a delayed data feed, the numbers on your screen will completely freeze. The trade still happened, your terminal just hasn't painted the chart yet.
That is exactly the architecture. And public RPC nodes frequently suffer under heavy load during a token migration. They lag, they drop queries, or they return cache data instead of the latest block state. Furthermore, a wallet might not automatically index the new smart contract address for the A token. It might not even know what to look for.
So, if that's the case, how do we bypass the frozen terminal to find the actual truth?
The documentation points back to Unicove, specifically its function as an advanced block explorer. An explorer is a much more robust infrastructure designed to parse the raw block data continuously. You take your account name or your public key, bypass the local wallet UI entirely, and query the chain directly through the explorer.
And if Unicove's Explorer shows that the A tokens are sitting in your account balance?
Then the state transition was completely successful, the funds are cryptographically secure, the issue is entirely localized to your wallet software.
What a relief that would be.
Right. The remedies are purely administrative at that point. Refresh the connection, clear your browser's application cache to force a new RPC query, or just manually add the A token's contract address to the wallet's display registry.
But what if you check the Explorer and the transaction isn't there at all? The guide addresses the pending transaction symptom. You signed the payload, but there is no irreversible hash, and your legacy EOS hasn't moved an inch.
If the transaction hash does not appear on the Block Explorer at all, it means your local client failed to broadcast the signed message to the mempool, or the network's minimum fee parameters rejected it before it could be propagated. In this scenario, the transaction simply doesn't exist to the network. You just need to verify your node connection and reinitiate the sequence.
The troubleshooting guide also spends significant time on the adversarial human element, because a major liquidity event like this migration is basically blood in the water for phishing syndicates.
Yeah.
We aren't just talking about clumsy spam emails anymore. The architecture of Web3 phishing is incredibly sophisticated.
It's terrifying. The guide heavily emphasizes verifying domain names and utilizing saved bookmarks for critical infrastructure like Unicove.
Let's talk about homograph attacks, because this is where the visual nature of the web really works against us. A user searches for Unicove Migration Portal, clicks the sponsored link, and the site looks identical. The Vaulta logo is there, the blue swap buttons are there, but the domain name is using a Cyrillic character that looks exactly like a standard Latin O.
To the human eye, it is entirely indistinguishable. But under the hood, the UI is connected to a malicious smart contract. When the user clicks connect and initiates what they think is the native one-to-one swap, the malicious site serves them a completely different transaction payload to sign.
Instead of signing a deterministic burn and mint function, the user is signing an ETH-sign request or a sweeping approval function that grants the attacker's contract total control over the wallet's legacy assets.
Exactly.
And because the user has been conditioned to just click approve in their wallet pop-up, they authorize the theft without even realizing it.
Which really underscores the guide's absolute prohibition against interacting with unexpected prompts, urgency-driven pop-ups, or unsolicited private messages from, quote, support staff. The immutable nature of the ledger means that once that malicious signature is broadcast and finalized, the assets are gone. There is no central authority to reverse the state change.
The document also warns against airdrop poisoning. This is a brilliant, terrifying vector. You are preparing for the migration, you check your wallet on an Explorer, and suddenly you see a massive deposit of a token you've never heard of, say, Vaulta bonus token, with a memo attached directing you to a website to claim a migration reward.
Yeah, the tokens themselves are completely worthless, but they serve as a physical advertisement dropped directly into your financial ledger.
And if you go to that site and try to swap or sell those bonus tokens, the smart contract you interact with is designed to drain your actual valuable assets. It's essentially a digital landmine disguised as free money. The rule is simple. Ignore them entirely.
Never touch them. And this leads to the final protocol in the document, post-migration hygiene. Particularly for users who navigated the cross-chain bridges and DX aggregators, the migration isn't over just because the A tokens are finally in the wallet.
Right, because we talked about those allowance mappings earlier. If you approved LIFI or Rango to move your wrapped tokens, those permissions are still live.
The documentation references using a tool like revoke.cache. This is a critical security procedure.
How does a tool like that actually interact with the chain to clean up the mess?
Well, revoke.cache is essentially an interface that scans the blockchain for every single approve event associated with your public key. It aggregates a list of every smart contract you have ever granted permission to and the specific token allowance for each. It is a visual representation of your wallet's active attack surface.
Like looking at a ledger of every single person who has a master key to your house.
Exactly. And the interface allows you to generate a new transaction payload for each of those contracts, specifically setting the allowance mapping back to 0. You broadcast those revocation transactions to the network, the state is updated, and the smart contracts lose their cryptographic ability to pull your funds.
It is the ultimate housekeeping task. And the final recommendation in the guide is architectural. If you manage meaningful value, use a compatible hardware wallet.
A hardware wallet addresses the fundamental vulnerability of operating system environments. If you are using a hot wallet, a browser extension, or a desktop application, your encrypted private keys are stored on the exact same hard drive that handles your web browsing, your email downloads, and your potential malware infections.
Right, so if a keylogger or a clipboard hijacking Trojan compromises your machine, they can extract the key store file, capture your decryption password, and drain the wallet remotely.
But a hardware wallet physically segregates the key generation and storage into a dedicated secure element chip. The private key never interacts with the internet-connected computer. When you initiate the Unicove swap, the transaction payload is sent via USB or Bluetooth to the hardware device. You must physically inspect the transaction data on the device's screen and press a physical button to apply the cryptographic signature.
Okay, so it physically requires you to be there.
Yes. The signed message is then sent back to the computer to be broadcast.
So even if your entire computer is totally compromised by a malicious payload, the attacker cannot steal the underlying cryptographic key. They are physically locked out of the core protocol.
It radically reduces the attack vectors available to bad actors, shifting the security burden entirely to the physical device and the offline seed phrase backup we discussed earlier.
Okay, so if we synthesize this entire migration manual, we've defined the routes, recognizing that liquidity fragmentation forces completely different strategies. We've established the hardware and network prerequisites, marveling at the frictionless reality of the delegated resource model with gray mass fuel.
Yeah.
We've executed the native swap, rigorously adhering to the test tranche methodology to prove our local environment. We've navigated the adversarial terrain of cross-chain bridging, neutralizing the infinite approval mappings and MEV slippage traps. And we've learned how to isolate wallet UI failures from actual blockchain state realities.
We really have mapped the entire technical and psychological landscape of the May 1st, 2026 Vaulta migration.
Let's summarize the immutable takeaways for you, the listener, as you prepare to execute this transition. First, if you hold native EOS, the Unicove portal via Anchor Wallet is the only logical path. The gray mass fuel integration eliminates gas friction, and the direct contract interaction guarantees deterministic one-to-one execution without AMM slippage. Second, the test tranche is non-negotiable. Isolate your operational risk by broadcasting a nominal amount and waiting for the irreversible state confirmation before committing your total portfolio.
Crucial step.
Third, if your assets are wrapped on an EVM chain, you must manage your smart contract approvals meticulously. Never sign an infinite allowance, and always utilize a revocation tool post-migration to zero out your contract exposure.
And finally, I want to return to that single word displayed on the Unicove success screen, the status indicator we discussed earlier. Irreversible.
Yeah, it carries a massive psychological weight in this context.
It really does, because it represents a profound departure from how modern society interacts with financial infrastructure. For decades, we have been insulated by centralized custodial systems.
Hmm.
We operate under the assumption of a safety net. If a credit card is stolen, we initiate a chargeback.
Right.
If we wire money to the wrong account, a compliance officer at the bank can often intervene, freeze the routing, and reverse the ledger entry. We are conditioned to expect an undo button for human error.
We treat digital permanence as a suggestion, not a mathematical law.
Exactly. But a decentralized ledger strips away that administrative layer. It offers absolute, uncensorable financial sovereignty. No state actor can freeze your Vaulta account, and no corporation can deny your transaction. You hold the ultimate authority.
Right.
But the price of that sovereignty is the absolute finality of the state machine. When the block producers validate your migration signature and that green check mark appears with the word irreversible, the universe of the blockchain has fundamentally changed state. The mathematics are settled. The energy is spent. There is absolutely no appeal process.
It forces a completely different level of personal responsibility.
It does, and this raises an important question for you to mull over, not just as you execute this specific EOS to a token migration, but as you continue to navigate the expanding architecture of decentralized finance.
Oh, yes?
The technology has successfully eliminated the middleman, but are we, as everyday operators, truly psychologically prepare for the unforgiving permanence of irreversible money?
That is the ultimate test of this entire ecosystem. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. We hope this breakdown of the technical mechanics, the contract vulnerabilities, and the verification protocols gives you the clarity you need to handle your portfolio. Approach your token swap with the rigor of a protocol engineer. Trust the math. Always send your test tranche, and we will see you on the Vaulta network.